G'day brewers, Brulosophy has just dropped a new video with Kade from the BruLab, and he talks about the top 3 things he's learnt from doing that podcast. Now the BruLab I found very helpful. It had a lot of interesting scientific information, but I lost a bit of interest along the way because a lot of it I found was more applicable to the professional brewing world. Anyway, in this video I'm going to do a reaction to that Brulosophy video, and I want to talk about how these 3 things that Kade talks about can improve your brewing at
the
home.
IPAs. And so what brewers were seeing is they're adding hops to beer that's done fermenting, like a dry hop addition, right? You're at the end of fermentation and maybe you've crashed your beer down a little bit. You add dry hops to it, and then a bunch of things happen. One is you start to see CO2 bubble off of your fermenter. The pressure increases. You start to see higher alcohol content in your beer, and people are like, oh man, what's going on? The other thing is diacetyl. You start to see diacetyl. Where does this hop creep thing come from? Is it in the hop itself? Is it microbes on top of the hop? And there's been kind of this debate between scientists about where it comes from. And so Matt Cottrell, which is a brewer at Heavy Seas Brewing Company, he developed this experiment to look and see, where is it coming from? Is it microbes or is it hop creep? And so through his experiment, he essentially found that, hey, hops actually contain DNA that encodes for amylases. So those enzymes that turn starch into sugar that the yeast then consume and make into alcohol and CO2, hops actually have that DNA. They can code, they can make those enzymes. And it was kind of the first time.
Yeah, so that's a little bit of a nerdy one. Basically, we already knew that hop creep happened, and we knew about diacetyl and all these things that happen, that the final gravity of the beer drops a little bit. We knew about all that, but what Kade's saying is Matt Cottrell has done this, I guess this DNA sequencing probably, to find this is the DNA to produce the enzyme that causes this dry hop effect. What's a take home for us home brewers with dry hop? Well, even if you've finished your beer and it's completely finished fermenting, if you then add hops to the beer, it's going to drop a couple of gravity points. That's the first thing, because these enzymes, these amylases, are just like creating another mash inside your fermenter. They are going to start cutting up dextrins into smaller digestible sugars that your yeast can then transform into alcohol. It might only be a couple of points, but it will have an effect. You'll get a slightly thinner beer and a slight bump in your alcohol. Now, this diacetyl that Kade mentions is probably the biggest issue with this process. If you don't allow this process to finish out, that is, this process where the amylases cut up the dextrins into simple sugars and then the yeast consumes them, and then the yeast will have to consume its own diacetyl again, you will end up with diacetyl in your finished beer. It's a byproduct of fermentation. So what's the take home after all the nerdy science stuff? If you finish out your beer, you finish your fermentation, you reach your final gravity, and then you put hops into your keg, you need to allow sufficient time for that process to finish. You need to allow enough time for that yeast to finish cleaning up those simple sugars and its own waste product, that is diacetyl, in the fermentation. Otherwise, if you bottle that too early, you're going to end up with diacetyl, that buttery popcorn taste in your finished beer. So if you want to avoid that, make sure you keep the temperature up to allow the yeast to finish its job, and give it enough time to do that before you package your finished beer. Otherwise, you will invite disappointment into your life. All right, let's continue on.
Now, number 2 relates to yeast starter strength. I just canned a whole bunch of wort for 1040 OG starters, but turns out much lower gravity starters can be advantageous. Was my canning exercise a waste of time?
Maybe you've been wasting the sugar that's going into the batches. The first brewing book I ever read was John Palmer's How to Brew. And I think in the first chapter, of that book, it tells you to make a yeast starter and says something like 1036, 1038, or 1040. Create this wort, pitch your yeast in, and then use that for fermentation. And it's so funny because
Chunky.
that's how brewers have been doing it for a really long time. And it turns out brewers' yeast really like that. But yeast actually have two energy production mechanisms. Fermentation, which is why we like them, because fermentation results in alcohol and CO2. And then they respire. They can respire just like you and me, breathing in oxygen to get energy. And in the presence of sugar, yeast ferment. So in a high concentration of sugar, lots of fermentation is going to happen. And it doesn't matter if there's oxygen present or not. But the sugar content is what drives this for yeast. So the second episode that was super surprising for me was this episode from Dr. Maria Mutsoglu, where she was at Sierra Nevada at the time. She was trying to optimize their propagation methods, and she found out, hey, respiration for humans, the reason why we're much bigger and we can do more things and run and do things like that is because we generate a lot of energy. And fermentation doesn't generate very much energy. Generates a little bit, but respiration generates like 10 times the amount of energy that fermentation does. So she looked at this as a microbiologist and said, hey, what if I made brewing yeast respire? And so I do that by reducing the amount of sugar in the starter. So started at like 1004 or 1008 starter instead of 1040. Put very low amounts of sugar. The number that you need to remember is 2 grams per liter of sugar. So lower than that number and it will respire. And so if you can encourage the yeast to do this, they'll stock up this energy and create this huge energy bank that when you put them in the fermentation, they may actually ferment quicker and they may drive all the way to attenuation where some yeast won't. So she did this, propagated up the yeast using a low strength starter, also added some nitrogen in there so the yeast have the right nutrients. And she found faster fermentation times, better and more quality yeast by using a smaller strength starter, which was hugely surprising. And then you can reduce the strength of your starter and maybe have better and healthier yeast.
All right, number 3.
All right, before we go on to number 3, this is super interesting. We're going to have to look more into this. Maybe we'll do our own experiment, see how we go. I like doing a non-alcoholic brew or a smaller brew to use as a starter for a bigger beer, and it seems to work quite well for me. But and sometimes the fermentability of those batches are really similar to this. They're really quite low. So maybe I'm doing actually the ideal thing to have healthy yeast by using that technique. Maybe you should give that a go at home. Brew a non-alcoholic beer and then use the dregs, the trub at the bottom, to do fuller strength, mid-strength, or up even high-strength gravity beer.
Dirty beer lines.
Yeah, dirty beer lines are a big problem, right? I mean, how many times have you hopefully this hasn't happened to you, but I'm sure it has. You've gone to a bar or something, or you're at your house and you haven't cleaned your draft lines in a while. You go to taste your amazing hoppy beer. You run it through the draft line and it tastes like sour butter. You need to replace your draft lines every so often to prevent biofouling. That's like the growth of microbes and bacteria and things that are going to ruin the flavor of your beer. And so this researcher, Cameron Selna, he was in talks with some of the folks he was brewing with, going, hey, hops have antimicrobial capacity. This is one of the reasons why we use hops in beer. They kill microbes. Microbes hate the bittering acids that are in hops. What if we took some bitter hop extract and coated the inside of our draft lines with it to prohibit microbes from attaching and growing? And hey, it worked. You can actually slow the growth of microbes in your beer draft lines by coating them with bitter hop extract.
Yeah, so that's probably more for professional brewers. As home brewers, we're not going to spend all that money putting. I don't think professional brewers would, or bars, putting flowable hop extracts in their beer lines. It's an expensive sort of process, but yeah. Anyway, it's interesting, I guess, that it works and it makes sense, right?
Now, I had some questions as to how to do this. Like, do I need a gallon of hop extract or something?
I mean, sure, there's probably dosing rates that you can get into. But yeah, I mean, making a dilute solution of water and hop extract and then running that through your beer lines, because some of that extract is going to coat the inside of the beer line. We think about beer lines as being really smooth, but they're not. They're actually like really rigid and porous. And so that's where microbes will get into. They'll get into those little cracks and stuff and grow from those cracks. But that's also where those bitter hop acids will get into too, is they'll get stuck in those cracks. And then when the microbe tries to get in there to grow, it dies because it hates those bitter hop acids.
Now, for each of these...
Pour into fresh, unspoiled beer from crystal clear draft lines and check out this video, which runs through my process for cleaning draft lines with a pump.